Recently, you received the Terra Nova reports explaining how your child did on our recent giving of the Terra Nova test. As you look at the report, there's much information here. I will try to give you some indication of what this can mean. On page 1 of the individual profile report, you should see something similar to this with many different subtests and objectives. Depending upon the grade level of your child, you may not see all of these particular subtests and objectives. Within each subtest, we have a varying number of objectives based on their grade level and what is anticipated to have been learned by children at that grade level. These columns give an indication of how your child fared on this particular sub-objective. So, for example, this child scored a 91 on the OPI scale. OPI stands for Objectives Performance Index, and that means that they would have scored a 91 out of a possible 100 had the test been only on basic understanding in reading. The next column shows the national OPI. That means the average of all students that took this test in grade 4, month 7, scored on average a 79. And the next column shows the difference between these two numbers. So this student scored above the national average on this particular objective. The last column shows the moderate mastery range. The moderate mastery range is defined to be students having some abilities in this particular area, but they have not mastered it. The moderate mastery range for this particular objective is 48 to 70. All of this information is summarized in the graph to the right. This is the moderate to mastery range. This black dot here tells exactly where your child scored, and the line shows the range that we would anticipate the child scoring if this were given over and over. So for this particular student, in this particular objective, they have a darkened black dot. That means they are at high mastery according to the key. So they are at a high mastery level, and furthermore, if they were to take this test again, we would expect them to score in the high mastery range once again. So as you look quickly down the list here, each of the places where you see a darkened bubble, you are looking at a student that has scored at a high mastery range. In the case of editing skills under language, they did score at a high mastery range, but it is also possible, if this were given more, that they would score in the moderate mastery range. So they have done well. The circles that have a shaded in at the bottom and are empty at the top are in the moderate mastery range. These are students that in this particular area, they are at a moderate mastery. They are close to grade level, but they need to do a little bit better in order to get a complete mastery. So for example, in evaluating or extending the meaning of words in reading, this student is at a moderate mastery level, and we would expect him to always be in that level on this test if he were to take it again. Finally, if you look down under science inquiry, you notice that it is not shaded in at all. This is an area of concern because this means that the student has a low mastery of this particular area of science. If you turn the page over to the back, you should see a report similar to what is on your screen now. This is your child's norm reference scores on the test. This is not looking at each individual objective, but it is looking at each subtest in its entirety. The first column is the anticipated norm curve equivalence. That is a score that is calculated for each student based upon how they have scored in taking the Terra Nova in the past and how they scored on the in-view part of this particular test. It is a calculated, estimated score of what the child would make on this test. So if we look at language, this child has an anticipated score of 53. The next column is the ACSI local percentile and local stay 9. ACSI stands for Association of Christian Schools International, and it is the accrediting agency that we are a part of. ACSI students in this language section, they average at a 65th percentile. So this particular student scored in the 53rd norm curve equivalence. The average ACSI student scores in the 65th percentile. That means he scored as well as or better than 65% of the people taking the test. If we look at the norm curve equivalence, that's the next column. This column says that he actually scored in the 50th percentile, and we expected it to be in the 53rd percentile. So he scored slightly lower than we anticipated. Will definitely be some discrepancy between the anticipated and the actual score, so a difference of a few points is nothing to be alarmed by. If we skip over to the difference column, those are the areas that highlight strengths and weaknesses. For example, in social studies, this child was anticipated to be in the 61st percentile. They actually scored in the 70th, so therefore they are considered significantly above. In the math composition, in the total score, they are considered significantly below. This column is called the national percentile and the stay 9 that it is. So the national average in social studies, for example, is the 71st percentile, and this student scored in the 70th percentile. So they are very similar to what the national average is. If we look at science, the national percentile is 69th. So that's the average student. But if we look, this student particularly scored in the 51st percentile, so he is below average in this particular area. The national percentile range is a range of where the most scores occur. If we look at the national percentile scale over here, this graph gives us much of the same information, but only in a graphical interface. As you can see, the 50th percentile is considered average. This particular student is above average in all areas, but they are not dramatically above average. Dramatically above average would be considered anything from about the 75th to 80th percentile and higher. In addition to the Terra Nova Achievement Test, your student also took the in-view test. This is a test of your child's ability, similar to an IQ test. The first thing I want to bring your attention to is the CSI score in the middle of your page. CSI stands for Cognitive Skills Index and can be related to the IQ. This score is a good indication of the ability of your child. This student has a CSI of 111. The average CSI is 100. Because of the number of students that take it, this is a perfectly normal distribution of scores. What that means is that we would expect 68% of students to be within 16 points of 100, meaning between 16 above it at a 116 or 16 below it at 84. So 68% of the people would score between 84 and 116. This particular student has a CSI of 111, which means that they are slightly above average. If you look at the areas above this, the normed reference scores, this tells how your student scored in areas within the in-view score. The NPA stands for the National Percentile by Age. So based on the age of this child scored in the 29th percentile in sequences. By grade, scored in the 31st percentile. Finally, you should have a Bible assessment report explaining how your child did on the Bible section of the recent giving of the standardized test. This is a section specifically for schools that are in the ACSI, so the report looks slightly different than the Terra Nova reports that we saw earlier. Each student is tested over their knowledge in these specific areas here. A more detailed list of what those objectives are can be gotten from the school. The scores are then calculated and a child is rated as advanced, proficient, basic, or below basic. Based upon how your child scores, you should see a check mark in one of these boxes. If you have any questions about your child specifically and their scores, please feel free to contact the school and set up a time to meet with myself or one of the teachers.